Dr. Ethan Carter had seen his share of strange viruses, but nothing like this. He sat in his dimly lit lab, eyes fixed on the latest blood sample. The cells, if they could even be called that anymore, moved unnaturally, writhing as if alive. He had spent the past 3 months studying reports of bizarre, violent attacks, and every piece of evidence led to a terrifying conclusion. This was no ordinary outbreak. He took a deep breath and grabbed his phone. "We have to act now," he said the moment his boss, Dr. Angela Morris, answered. "This virus is like nothing we've ever seen. It spreads through bites, and the infected, they don't just get sick. They change." A heavy silence followed. Then, Dr. Morris sighed. "Ethan, we've been over this. The government doesn't want panic. We'll continue monitoring the situation, but we're not authorized to make public announcements yet." Ethan gritted his teeth. "There might not be a public left if we wait too long." Before Dr. Morris could respond, an urgent news alert popped up on Ethan's computer screen. "Breaking: man attacks family, believed to be under the influence of unknown substance." A shaky video played. A man, his skin deathly pale, lunged at his wife, sinking his teeth into her shoulder. Blood spurted as she screamed. The footage cut off abruptly. Ethan's stomach turned. "Angela, turn on the news." A few miles away, Officer Daniel Rhodes was responding to a distress call in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio. "Multiple reports of violent behavior on Oakwood Street. Be advised, suspect is extremely aggressive." Daniel pulled up in front of a modest house. The door was ajar, blood smeared across the white wood. He stepped inside cautiously, his hand on his gun. "Hello? This is Officer Rhodes. If anyone needs help, call out now." A low, guttural growl answered him. Daniel turned the corner and froze. A man crouched over a motionless woman, tearing at her flesh with his teeth. Her eyes were wide with terror, her fingers twitching slightly. "Sir! Step away now," Daniel commanded, heart pounding. The man's head snapped up. His eyes were milky white, his mouth dripping crimson. Then, with a bone-chilling snarl, he launched himself at Daniel. Instinct took over. Daniel fired. The bullet struck the attacker's chest, but he didn't stop. He kept coming. Panic surged through Daniel as he fired again, this time at the head. The man collapsed instantly. The woman on the ground shuddered. A strangled breath escaped her lips. Then, her body twitched violently. She sat up, eyes turning the same milky white as her attackers. Daniel staggered back. "No, no way." She turned her gaze to him and lunged. Across town, Ethan rushed through the hospital corridors. Patients were being wheeled in on stretchers, screaming and convulsing. Doctors barked orders, but nothing they did seemed to help. One woman's heart monitor flatlined. A nurse moved to cover her with a sheet, when suddenly, she sat up and grabbed the nurse's wrist. The nurse screamed as the woman bit into her arm. Security guards rushed in. Chaos erupted. Ethan backed away, breath quickening. It's happening. The virus is spreading too fast. He needed to get out. He needed to find people who would listen. But as he turned to leave, the hospital doors burst open. Dozens of figures poured inside, their movements jerky, their eyes blank. The nightmare had begun. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a scream. Ethan Carter sprinted through the chaotic hospital, dodging panicked doctors and nurses as the infected tore through the hallways. Blood sprayed across the white tile floors, bodies collapsed in violent spasms, and the air filled with the sickening sound of tearing flesh. A doctor tried to barricade a door, his hands shaking as he shoved a hospital bed against it. "Help me," he pleaded. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then the door burst open. A horde of pale, blood-soaked figures poured in. The doctor barely had time to scream before they swarmed him. Ethan turned and ran. By the time he reached the parking lot, the city skyline was already ablaze. Fires raged in the distance. Sirens wailed. The streets were in complete chaos. People ran in every direction, some screaming, others already turning. A man clutched his wife's body, sobbing uncontrollably. "Stay with me, baby. You're gonna be okay, I swear." But as Ethan watched, the woman twitched violently. Her fingers curled into claws. Her eyes snapped open, milky white and soulless. "Sarah," the man whispered. She lunged. Ethan averted his eyes as the man's screams faded into the growing madness. He had to keep moving. Across the city, Officer Daniel Rhodes slammed the door of his squad car shut, breathing heavily. His hands were covered in blood, not his own. The radio crackled. "All units," the dispatcher's voice was frantic. "We are losing control, there are too many of them." "The infected are," a guttural growl cut her off, followed by a scream. The line went dead. Daniel grabbed the radio. "Dispatch? Dispatch, do you copy?" Nothing. A gunshot rang out in the distance. Then another. The sound of battle echoed through the streets. Daniel gritted his teeth and hit the gas. He sped past burning cars, past people pounding on windows begging for help, past bodies littering the sidewalks. He had seen disasters before. He had worked riots, mass shootings, but this was different. This was the end. Ethan reached his apartment building, heart hammering. He needed supplies. A weapon. Anything. The elevator was dead, so he took the stairs 2 at a time. On the 3rd floor, a neighbor stumbled out of his apartment, eyes glassy, mouth stained red. Ethan barely dodged as the man lunged. He slammed the door to his own apartment, locking it. His mind raced. How did it spread this fast? Was it airborne? No, it had to be through bites. His eyes fell on his TV screen. Emergency broadcasts flashed in red. "Stay indoors. Do not attempt to leave the city. Await further instructions." A shaky live feed appeared, military personnel struggling to contain a growing horde outside a quarantine zone. "Hold the line," an officer shouted. Then the camera fell. The screams that followed sent chills down Ethan's spine. The power flickered. Then the screen went black. Ethan clenched his fists. There were no instructions. No one was coming to save them. He grabbed his backpack, stuffing it with food, medical supplies, and anything else useful. Then he hesitated. His father's old revolver sat in a locked case on the shelf. He had never wanted to use it. Now, he had no choice. Downtown, Daniel arrived at the police station to find it under siege. Officers had barricaded the entrance, firing into an oncoming wave of infected. "Rhodes! Get inside, now," his captain shouted. Daniel barely made it through the doors before they were slammed shut. Officers pushed desks and lockers against the entrance, their faces pale with terror. "How bad is it?" Daniel asked, catching his breath. His captain shook his head. "Bad. This isn't a riot, Rhodes. This is something else." A radio crackled nearby. "The government is deploying bombers," a voice announced. "They're going to level the city." Silence filled the room. Then someone whispered, "We're already dead." Ethan stood at his window, gripping the revolver. Outside, the city burned. A military helicopter flew overhead, its spotlight scanning the streets. Then, without warning, a missile streaked across the sky. A deafening explosion shook the building. Ethan's eyes widened as he realized the truth. They weren't saving the city. They were erasing it. And he had only one chance to escape before he became just another statistic in the fall of civilization. Ethan Carter had seen enough disasters in his career as a virologist, but nothing compared to the burning wreckage of the city below. Explosions rocked the streets, sending plumes of fire into the sky. The military had started bombing the worst infected zones, wiping out entire neighborhoods to stop the spread. But it wasn't working. The virus had moved too fast. Ethan tightened the straps on his backpack. Staying in his apartment was a death sentence. He had seen a message scrawled in blood on a nearby building. Safe zone at Edgewood Stadium. It was his only hope. Gun in hand, he took a deep breath and pushed open his apartment door. The hallway was eerily silent. Bodies lay in grotesque positions, some half-eaten, others with bullet wounds. The smell of rot clung to the air. He moved quickly, stepping over the corpses. Just as he reached the stairwell, a soft gurgling sound made him freeze. A woman, her eyes clouded, her mouth smeared with blood, stumbled from a nearby doorway. Ethan raised his gun, hands shaking. She snarled and lunged. Bang! The shot echoed through the hallway. The woman crumpled, but the sound had drawn attention. More growls. More footsteps. Ethan turned and ran. Edgewood Stadium, 2 hours later. Officer Daniel Rhodes slammed his baton against the steel gate of the stadium. "Let us in," he shouted. A group of civilians huddled behind him, terrified, exhausted, desperate. A guard on the other side peered down, gripping an assault rifle. "We're full," he shouted back. "No more room." Daniel cursed under his breath. "You don't understand." A blood-curdling scream interrupted him. The infected had arrived. They poured into the parking lot like a flood, dozens of them, running, clawing, snarling. Daniel turned to the civilians. "Move!" Panic erupted. Some ran toward the gates, pounding on the metal. Others sprinted in random directions, hoping for an escape that didn't exist. A young woman tripped, screaming as the undead closed in. Daniel fired his last 3 bullets, 2 hits, 1 miss. The infected didn't even slow down. He grabbed the woman and yanked her up. "Keep moving." Above them, the stadium guard hesitated. He watched as people were torn apart just feet from the gate. Then, with a sigh, he waved to his partner. "Open it." The steel doors groaned as they slid open just enough for Daniel and a few others to squeeze through. But not all of them made it. A father carrying his son tripped, and the doors slammed shut behind him. The last thing Daniel saw was the boy's terrified face as his father screamed for help. Then they were gone. Inside, the stadium was nothing like Daniel expected. Hundreds of survivors sat on the bleachers, wrapped in blankets or huddled in groups. Soldiers patrolled the walkways, their faces hard, their fingers never leaving their triggers. A man in a blood-stained military uniform approached. "Name?" "Rhodes." "Officer Daniel Rhodes, LCPD." The soldier nodded. "You're lucky. This is the last safe zone left in the city. But we don't have much time." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" The soldier's eyes darkened. "This place won't hold forever." 1 mile away. Ethan moved through the ruins of the city, his gun heavy in his grip. He was close now, Edgewood Stadium was in sight. But something was wrong. A convoy of military trucks sped past him, loaded with supplies, soldiers, and, most disturbingly, scientists in hazmat suits. Ethan's stomach twisted. Why were the scientists leaving? He ducked behind a burned-out car and listened. "The stadium won't hold much longer," one of the men said. "Command wants us out before it falls." "Are they even gonna warn the people inside?" another asked. A pause. Then, coldly, "No." Ethan's blood ran cold. The last safe zone wasn't safe at all. And soon, it was going to be overrun. Inside Edgewood Stadium, Daniel sat against the wall, listening to the distant growls beyond the gates. Something didn't feel right. The guards were tense. Supplies were already running low. And worst of all, no one was telling them the truth. He had survived the fall of civilization. But if he wanted to keep surviving, he needed to get out, before Edgewood became a mass grave. And he had no idea that, just outside, Ethan Carter was thinking the exact same thing. Ethan Carter crouched behind a burned-out truck, his heart pounding as he processed what he had just heard. The military was abandoning the stadium. The so-called last safe zone was nothing more than a temporary death trap. If he didn't get inside soon, it might be too late. He scanned the perimeter. The main entrance was crawling with armed guards, but near the east side, an old service tunnel sat unguarded. He took a deep breath and sprinted toward it. The tunnel was dark, damp, and smelled of rot. He stepped cautiously, gun in hand. The deeper he went, the more unsettling the silence became. Then he heard it. A soft shuffle. He froze. Something was in here with him. Inside Edgewood Stadium. Daniel Rhodes had been a cop long enough to know when people were lying. The soldiers here weren't protecting the survivors, they were just keeping them contained. Supplies were running low, and tensions were rising. Something was about to go very, very wrong. A woman, dirty, exhausted, sat beside him, whispering. "Have you noticed? The guards keep disappearing. They say they're out on patrol, but none of them come back." Daniel nodded. "They're leaving us behind." She swallowed. "So what do we do?" Daniel glanced at the locked gate. If the military was really planning to abandon the stadium, he needed a way out before the infected swarmed in. And he needed to find out who could be trusted. Because in a world like this, the living were just as dangerous as the dead. In the tunnel, Ethan held his breath as the sound of shuffling footsteps grew louder. Then, movement. A figure lurched out of the darkness. Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired once, twice, both shots hitting center mass. The figure stumbled, but didn't fall. Eyes wide, Ethan aimed higher and fired again. This time, the body dropped. As the echoes of the gunshot faded, Ethan realized he had a problem. He wasn't alone anymore. Inside the stadium, midnight. Daniel was awake when the screaming started. He jumped to his feet, gun in hand. Around him, survivors panicked as a soldier was dragged into the shadows, his throat torn open. Someone inside had turned. Gunfire erupted as the infected survivor attacked wildly, biting anyone within reach. Daniel raised his gun but hesitated. The infected man had been fine just hours ago. That meant. His eyes darted to the terrified faces around him. Someone here was hiding a bite. And that meant more were going to turn. Ethan reaches the stadium. Ethan had just emerged from the service tunnel when he heard the gunfire. He pressed himself against the stadium wall, heart pounding. The infection had already reached inside. No time to be cautious. He ran. Betrayal in the chaos. Daniel saw it happen too late. A group of survivors had rushed toward the exit gates, demanding to be let out. One of the guards, a man with a scarred face, didn't hesitate. He shot them. No warning. No hesitation. "Traitor," someone screamed. Scarface turned his gun on the crowd. "The infected are inside. If you don't follow orders, you're dead weight." Daniel clenched his fists. The infected were bad enough, but people like this? They were worse. And he had to stop them. Ethan and Daniel crossed paths. Ethan reached the inner stadium just as the chaos peaked. A group of soldiers were dragging bags of supplies toward a truck, preparing to leave. Survivors screamed, begging to be taken with them. But they weren't listening. Ethan's stomach twisted in disgust. The military knew this place was going to fall. And they were leaving everyone else to die. That's when he saw him. A cop, one of the survivors, standing between the soldiers and the terrified crowd, gun drawn. Ethan didn't know this man. But he knew one thing. If he wanted to live, he needed an ally. And Daniel Rhodes looked like a man who wasn't planning on dying tonight. Ethan stepped forward. "Hey, officer," he called out, raising his gun. "Mind if I even the odds?" Ethan and Daniel locked eyes across the chaos. The stadium had erupted into an all-out war zone, between the infected, the survivors, and the soldiers who had decided that saving themselves was more important than saving anyone else. Daniel was standing firm, gun raised, staring down the scar-faced soldier who had just executed a group of civilians without hesitation. Ethan, gripping his own weapon, made a split-second decision. He sprinted toward Daniel. The scar-faced soldier turned his gun toward Ethan, but before he could fire. Bang! Daniel's shot hit the soldier square in the chest. He stumbled back, coughing blood, then collapsed. Ethan skidded to a stop beside Daniel. "Nice shot." Daniel exhaled sharply. "You another civilian trying to get out of here?" Ethan shook his head. "Not just any civilian. I worked at the virology lab where this thing started. And I just overheard the military, they're leaving. This place is about to fall." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I figured as much. These bastards were never here to help." A scream cut through their conversation. One of the barricades had failed. The infected poured through. Survivors versus the Horde. The stadium became a bloodbath. The infected moved fast, lunging at the terrified survivors. Gunfire rang out, but every bullet spent meant one less chance at survival. Daniel grabbed Ethan's arm. "We need to move, now." They sprinted toward the loading docks at the back of the stadium. A group of desperate survivors ran beside them, but as they reached the exit, the heavy steel doors slammed shut. A soldier on the other side locked them and turned away without a second glance. "Hey! Open the damn door!" Daniel shouted, pounding against the metal. The soldier didn't stop. Ethan gritted his teeth. "They're sealing us in." A woman behind them shrieked as the infected closed in. Daniel cursed under his breath. "We have to find another way out." The secret exit. Ethan scanned the stadium, his mind racing. Then he remembered. "The service tunnel," he said. "That's how I got in. If it's still clear, it's our only shot." Daniel nodded. "Lead the way." They turned and ran, weaving through the chaos. Survivors were fighting back with whatever they had: baseball bats, metal pipes, makeshift weapons. Some were trying to climb onto the stadium walls, only to be dragged down and devoured. The infected weren't stopping. They never stopped. By the time Ethan and Daniel reached the service tunnel, a few others had followed them, 6 in total. A teenage boy, a mother clutching her young daughter, a middle-aged man in a torn business suit, and an older woman with a hunting knife. Ethan yanked open the tunnel door. "Go! Move!" The survivors rushed inside. Daniel and Ethan followed, slamming the door shut behind them. But they weren't alone. The distant sound of shuffling echoed down the dark passage. "Shit," Daniel muttered. Ethan checked his gun. Only a few bullets left. "This tunnel leads outside the perimeter," he whispered. "If we make it to the end, we're free." The teenage boy clutched a metal pipe. "And if we don't?" Daniel tightened his grip on his gun. "Then we fight." The group moved forward cautiously, their footsteps barely making a sound. The flickering emergency lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. Then, from the darkness, A guttural snarl. Ethan barely had time to react before a figure lunged at him. A decayed corpse, wearing the tattered uniform of a stadium worker, grabbed his arm, jaws snapping. Ethan grunted, shoving it back. Daniel fired, the bullet tearing through its skull. More growls echoed through the tunnel. "They're coming," the older woman whispered. The survivors broke into a run. The infected emerged from the darkness, sprinting after them, their hollow eyes locked on fresh prey. The exit was just ahead. The mother tripped, her daughter screaming as she hit the ground. The businessman tried to pull her up, but an infected grabbed him first, sinking its teeth into his throat. Blood sprayed. He screamed. Daniel didn't hesitate, he shot the infected and grabbed the mother, hauling her to her feet. "Move!" They reached the exit. Ethan shoved against the heavy door, locked. "No!" Daniel turned, raising his gun, but his last bullet clicked empty. The infected were almost on them. Then, bang! The teenage boy swung his metal pipe, caving in a zombie's skull. He turned to Ethan. "Open the damn door." Ethan yanked out his last tool, a screwdriver. He jammed it into the rusted lock, twisting desperately. The lock snapped. The door burst open. The survivors tumbled outside, into the cold, night air. Ethan slammed the door shut just as the infected slammed into it from the other side. Panting, Daniel looked around. They had made it out of the stadium. But the city was still a nightmare. Fires burned in the distance. Gunfire crackled. The air stank of death. Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead. "We made it." The teenage boy shook his head. "For now." Daniel reloaded his gun, staring at the ruined skyline. "We need a plan. The stadium is lost. The city is lost. Where the hell do we go from here?" Ethan swallowed hard. He knew only one place that might still have answers. "The virology lab," he said. "That's where this all started. And if we want to survive." He met Daniel's gaze. "That's where we have to go next." The city was a war zone. Fires burned in the distance, illuminating the streets littered with wrecked cars, shattered glass, and half-eaten corpses. Gunfire crackled sporadically, followed by agonized screams. The dead wandered the roads in mindless herds, drawn to movement, sound, and, most of all, the scent of the living. Ethan, Daniel, and the 4 remaining survivors crouched in the shadows of a crumbling gas station, catching their breath after escaping the stadium. Daniel peered down the cracked highway. "You're sure the virology lab is still standing?" Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. "I don't know for sure. But if there's any chance of finding a cure or even understanding what we're dealing with, that's where we have to go." The teenage boy, Jackson, tightened his grip on the metal pipe he had been using as a weapon. "And how the hell are we supposed to get across the city? Look at this place." He gestured to the carnage ahead. Infected roamed freely, some feasting on bodies, others wandering aimlessly, waiting for their next victim. The mother, Lisa, clutched her young daughter's hand. "We need a car. There's no way we'll make it on foot." Ethan glanced at the gas station's parking lot. Most vehicles were wrecked or looted, but one old truck looked intact. "Wait here," he whispered. A desperate gamble. Ethan crouched low, moving toward the truck. His heart pounded as he checked inside, keys still in the ignition. Lucky break. Just as he reached for the door handle, a noise behind him made his blood run cold. A growl. Slowly, he turned. A single infected man stood just a few feet away. His skin was gray, torn in places where flesh had rotted away. His lips curled back in a snarl, teeth stained red. Ethan moved slowly, reaching for his gun. The zombie lunged. He barely had time to react. A gunshot rang out. Daniel stood at the gas station entrance, gun smoking. The infected crumpled to the ground, but the sound had already attracted attention. From the alleyways and buildings, more undead heads snapped toward them. Then, like a tidal wave, they came. The Great Escape. Get in the truck. Ethan shouted. Daniel, Jackson, Lisa, and the older woman, Martha, sprinted toward him. Lisa scooped her daughter into her arms, running as fast as she could. Ethan yanked the truck door open and jumped inside. He turned the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. Jackson leaped into the truck bed, gripping the sides as the vehicle lurched forward. Daniel climbed into the passenger seat while Lisa and Martha squeezed into the back. As Ethan slammed his foot on the gas, the infected swarmed the truck, clawing at the sides, trying to pull themselves up. Jackson swung his pipe, knocking one off. Another grabbed the edge. Daniel shot it in the head, sending it tumbling onto the pavement. The truck sped down the ruined highway. Behind them, the horde chased, but they were too slow. For now, they were safe. But the road ahead was long. And full of dangers. Blockades and betrayals. They drove for miles, weaving through wreckage, abandoned military vehicles, and countless bodies. The lab was still several miles away when they hit their first major obstacle. A blockade. Rows of burned-out cars and hastily constructed barriers blocked the road. Beyond it, figures moved, armed men, survivors who had claimed this part of the city for themselves. Daniel cursed. Looks like we're not the only ones trying to survive. Ethan stopped the truck. We have two choices. We either try to talk our way through, or we find another way. Lisa shook her head. We don't have enough gas to take a long detour. Jackson looked at the armed men. Something about them doesn't feel right. Before they could decide, one of the men raised a rifle and pointed it at them. Step out of the truck. Daniel's hand went to his gun. Ethan grabbed his arm. We don't want to start a fight. Martha leaned forward. But what if they do? The man with the rifle smirked. You got food? Ammo? Lisa held her daughter closer. We don't have anything to trade. Another survivor, a tall, scarred woman, grinned. Then you're worthless. The group tensed. Ethan realized too late. This wasn't a checkpoint. This was an ambush. Fight for survival. Gunfire erupted. Daniel shoved Lisa and Martha down behind the truck as bullets tore through the windshield. Ethan ducked as a shot whizzed past his head. Jackson leaped out of the truck bed, swinging his pipe into the nearest attacker's face. Blood sprayed as the man crumpled. Daniel took down another with a clean headshot. But there were too many. One of the raiders grabbed Ethan, slamming him against the truck. The world spun. A knife pressed against his throat. I'll make this quick, the raider sneered. Bang! The man's grip loosened. His eyes widened. Blood poured from his forehead as he collapsed. Lisa stood behind him, shaking, gun smoking in her hands. The remaining raiders hesitated. Daniel took the chance. He fired 3 quick shots, taking down 2 more. The rest fled into the darkness. Panting, Ethan wiped blood from his face. Let's go before more show up. The group piled back into the truck. Ethan hit the gas, speeding away. The last stretch. The city blurred past them as they drove in silence. Lisa stared at the gun in her lap, her hands trembling. I've never killed anyone before. Daniel looked at her. If you hadn't, we'd all be dead. Jackson leaned back, exhaling. This world's gone to hell. Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Up ahead, the lab loomed in the distance, a massive facility surrounded by high fences and razor wire. It looked intact. But the closer they got, the more Ethan's stomach twisted. Because something didn't feel right. The lab was too quiet. Too dark. Too empty. Daniel noticed it too. This place should be swarming with scientists, soldiers, someone. Ethan exhaled. Something's wrong. They had risked everything to get here. But what if they weren't walking into salvation? What if they were walking into something much, much worse? The truck rolled to a stop just outside the virology lab's main gate. The massive facility loomed before them, cold, silent, and untouched by the destruction that had consumed the city. Ethan stepped out first, gripping his gun tightly. The lab should have been swarming with scientists, soldiers, someone. But instead, there was only an eerie silence. Daniel climbed out beside him, eyes scanning the perimeter. I don't like this. Jackson swung down from the truck bed, pipe in hand. What if everyone inside is already dead? Lisa held her daughter close. Or worse, what if they're not? Martha, the older woman, adjusted the grip on her hunting knife. Only one way to find out. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward. The front doors were locked, but Ethan knew the security system. He pulled out his old ID badge and swiped it through the panel. A soft beep. The doors slid open. Inside, the air was stale. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows down the empty corridors. Something had happened here. Something bad. The ghost facility. The group moved cautiously through the halls. Papers were scattered across the floors, computer monitors still flickering with old warnings. Lisa looked around nervously. There's no blood. No bodies. Daniel frowned. Yeah. Which means they didn't die here. Ethan reached a security terminal and tapped on the keyboard. Most of the data had been wiped, but he managed to find an archived log. Last entry, 7 days ago. Status, full lockdown initiated. All personnel evacuated. He clenched his jaw. They knew the outbreak was coming. They abandoned this place before it got worse. Jackson peered over his shoulder. So they just left? No cure, no nothing. Ethan scrolled further. Then he found something that made his blood run cold. A single phrase. Project Revenant, active. His pulse quickened. Revenant. The classified project that only the highest-level researchers knew about. The project that had been designed as a failsafe. What the hell is Project Revenant? Daniel asked, reading over Ethan's shoulder. Ethan hesitated. It was our last-ditch effort. If the infection couldn't be controlled, we were developing something that could. Martha narrowed her eyes. Something that could what? Before Ethan could answer. A distant clatter. Something had moved. Inside the lab. Locked in with the unknown. Daniel raised his gun. We're not alone. Lisa held her daughter protectively. We need to get out of here. But before they could turn back. Bang! The security doors slammed shut behind them. A computerized voice echoed through the lab. Containment protocol engaged. Unauthorized presence detected. Ethan's stomach dropped. The lab's automated lockdown, we triggered it. Jackson cursed. You mean we're trapped in here? Martha sighed. Of course we are. Daniel clenched his jaw. Then we find another way out. Fast. Ethan nodded. The control room should have an override. But it's deep inside the lab. Lisa swallowed hard. Then we better move fast. They pushed forward, deeper into the heart of the lab. And that's when they found the first body. The experiment that went wrong. The scientist's corpse was slumped against the wall, a dried pool of blood beneath him. His lab coat was torn, his face twisted in terror. Jackson frowned. I thought you said there weren't any bodies. Daniel knelt beside the man, examining the wounds. These aren't bite marks. Ethan's throat tightened. The scientist hadn't been killed by zombies. Lisa gasped, pointing ahead. A massive security door stood slightly ajar, its steel frame dented, as if something had broken out from the inside. A faded label on the door read, "Project Revenant Test Chamber." Jackson took a step back. Nope. Nope, nope, nope. I don't like this. Martha gripped her knife. Whatever was in there, it's out now. Ethan swallowed hard. And it's still in the lab. Daniel stood, gripping his gun tighter. Then we moved carefully. They pressed forward, moving past the wrecked chamber. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the lab became. The walls had deep scratches in them. Doors had been ripped open, not unlocked. Something in here wasn't just infected. It was strong. And then they heard it. A slow, guttural breathing. Something was just ahead. Watching them. Waiting. The Revenant awakens. The group froze. A shadow shifted at the end of the corridor. Then it stepped into the dim light. It had once been a man. But now, it was something else. Its skin was wrong, pale, veined, pulsing with unnatural energy. Its eyes were hollow, empty pits of darkness. Clawed fingers twitched at its sides. Jackson exhaled. That's not a normal zombie. Ethan's blood ran cold. No, it's not. Lisa whispered, "What the hell is that?" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. Project Revenant. The creature turned its head slightly, as if listening to them. Then, in a horrifying blur of movement, it charged. Daniel fired. The bullet hit, but the Revenant barely flinched. Jackson swung his pipe, only for the creature to catch it mid-swing and fling him across the corridor like a ragdoll. Lisa screamed. Martha lunged with her knife, stabbing it in the chest, only for the Revenant to grab her wrist and snap it like a twig. She collapsed with a pained cry. Ethan grabbed Lisa and Jackson, dragging them back. Run! Daniel fired again, aiming for the head. This time, the Revenant staggered. It was strong. But not invincible. Daniel didn't hesitate. Go! I'll hold it off. Ethan shook his head. You won't last alone. Daniel reloaded, stepping forward. I don't plan to. The Revenant roared. Daniel met its hollow gaze. Then, he attacked. Ethan didn't wait to see what happened next. He grabbed Lisa, Jackson, and Martha, pulling them toward the control room. Behind them, Daniel fought like hell. But as they ran, Ethan had only one thought. Even if we escape this lab, what if this thing gets out too? The echoes of Daniel's gunfire faded behind them as Ethan, Lisa, Jackson, and Martha sprinted through the lab's cold, sterile hallways. The Revenant's guttural growls and the sound of metal being torn apart signaled that their time was running out. Lisa's breath was ragged as she carried her daughter. We can't just leave Daniel. Ethan didn't slow down. He knew what he was doing, buying us time. We have to shut this place down before that thing gets out. Martha, clutching her broken wrist, gritted her teeth. And if we fail? Ethan's jaw tightened. Then the world is already lost. They burst into the control room, a massive chamber filled with flickering monitors and panels displaying security overrides. The words "Lockdown Engaged" blinked in red across the main screen. Ethan rushed to the console. I can override the lockdown, but it'll take a few minutes. Jackson, bruised from being thrown by the Revenant, gripped his metal pipe, standing guard by the door. Something tells me we don't have a few minutes. Lisa set her daughter down in a corner, pressing a hand to the child's trembling back. It's okay, sweetie. We're almost safe. But even she wasn't sure if that was true. Then, a deep, inhuman roar shook the walls. The Revenant breaks through. The door behind them shuddered. Then another slam. Jackson flinched. Oh, hell no. The third impact dented the reinforced steel. Lisa grabbed her daughter and stepped back. It's coming. Martha, despite her injury, raised her knife. Then we better be ready. Ethan's fingers flew across the keyboard. Almost there, just a little longer. Then, with a metallic scream, the door was ripped open. The Revenant stood in the doorway, its hollow eyes locked onto them. Daniel was nowhere to be seen. Blood dripped from the creature's clawed hands. Lisa gasped. No. The Revenant stepped forward. Jackson swung his pipe, but the creature caught it midair and yanked it away, throwing the boy against the wall. He crumpled with a groan. Martha lunged, stabbing at its side. The blade sunk in, but the Revenant didn't even flinch. Instead, it grabbed her. With horrifying strength, it lifted the older woman and threw her across the room. She hit the wall and collapsed, unmoving. Ethan's heart pounded. Come on, come on. The computer beeped. Override sequence initiated. Self-destruct protocol engaged. Ethan's eyes widened. Self-destruct? A computerized voice echoed through the lab. Facility detonation in 5 minutes. Please evacuate immediately. Ethan turned. Run. Lisa grabbed her daughter and bolted. Jackson, wincing, pushed himself up and staggered after them. The Revenant lunged for Ethan. He barely dodged, feeling its claws slice through the air just inches from his face. Then he ran. The race against time. Alarms blared as they sprinted through the corridors. Red emergency lights flashed, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The entire facility shook as explosives deep within the lab began their countdown. Jackson panted. We're all gonna die, aren't we? Ethan growled. Not if we move faster. Lisa clutched her daughter's hand tightly. The exit, where is it? Ethan pointed ahead. There. Just. A blur of movement. The Revenant leaped from the shadows, cutting them off. Lisa screamed. Jackson grabbed a fallen soldier's gun, but his hands were shaking too much to aim. The Revenant roared. Then. Bang! A single gunshot rang out. The Revenant staggered. Behind it, Daniel. Bleeding, barely standing, but alive. He smirked weakly. Miss me? The Revenant turned, growling. Daniel took a step forward. I've got your attention now, huh? He lifted a grenade. Pulled the pin. Go. Ethan's eyes widened. Daniel. Daniel grinned. No time to argue, Doc. Then, he charged the Revenant. And as Ethan, Lisa, and Jackson turned and ran, the explosion tore through the hallway. Escape and the end of the nightmare. They burst through the emergency exit, sprinting away from the lab as fire and smoke erupted behind them. The force of the explosion sent them flying. Ethan hit the ground hard, coughing as debris rained down around them. Silence. Then, the sound of burning wreckage. Lisa groaned, shielding her daughter with her body. Jackson coughed, pushing himself up. Ethan turned back. The lab was gone. Just a massive, burning crater where it once stood. Lisa whispered, Did we stop it? Jackson exhaled. Daniel, his voice cracked. He really did it. Ethan's throat tightened, but he nodded. Yeah. He did. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then, Lisa's daughter stirred, looking up at her mother. Is it over? The little girl asked. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. She hugged her daughter tightly. Yeah, baby. It's over. But Ethan wasn't so sure. As he stared at the wreckage, a sinking feeling formed in his gut. They had destroyed the lab. They had killed the Revenant. But the virus. The virus was still out there. And the world was still burning. For now, though, they were alive. And that was all that mattered. The end.